Another Duetto Spider project? It seems like I've become a bit of a magnet for 1967 spiders. They keep finding me. This one belongs to a friend, and he's asked me to help him get it back on the road, which is no small job on this particular car. It's been off the road for a long time, and it's picked up some not so great workmanship over the years. It's a solid car, but there are a lot of issues keeping it from being a great, reliable driver. It's actually a little difficult to know where to start with these kind of projects. The biggest issues, as I've said, is the clutch and the carburetors. However, today I'm going to focus on something else, the heater system. An odd place to start, I know, but it's actually very important. Having a working heater system on one of these cars is a thing that can change the car from being a pain to drive regularly to being a pleasure. No one likes a foggy windshield or non-factory plumbing, so before I put the engine back, I will fix this heater box. The heater box in an Alfa 105 is a reliable and well-designed unit. Unfortunately, it's one of the most difficult parts of the car to get to. Removing and refitting these is one of my absolute worst jobs. It requires a type of under-dashboard yoga to get your hands to the nuts that hold it in place. And on a hot day, it's a lot of fun. I highly recommend it. This heater box has received a lot of love and attention in the past, unfortunately. It's mostly complete, but it's missing some factory pieces. Quite often, the heater valves and the fan motors are removed from these units, unnecessarily. This one is missing both of those parts, and they've been replaced with universal aftermarket parts, so some modifications have been made. This non-standard heater valve requires some very messy plumbing to connect it to the radiator, and that routing of the wire to open and shut it is, well, it's just awful. The sad thing about this kind of work is that often the original parts just need to be cleaned and serviced, and they'll work for another 50 years. Luckily, I have some original parts in my collection of spares, so I'll be putting all this right again. Apart from the incorrect valve, the main air vent flap doesn't work, and the radiator bypass flap inside the box is in backwards, so there's only room for improvement here. I've decided not to restore this unit, but to repair it. This car doesn't need to be totally restored in order to be a great usable classic, so I won't be repainting anything or replating it or making it perfect, just perfectly usable. The clips that hold this together must have been lost by whoever installed the valve, because it's held together with rivets, which is a shame, because those clips are almost impossible to find on the used market. Here is the non-original fan motor. Let's see if it works. This motor fits far lower than a standard one would. The fan blades are touching the plastic molding as they spin, and the plastic molding has been cut for clearance. This is not a tidy job at all. When placed next to a factory motor, you can see how short this universal one is. It's also mounted in a different way to the original one, using bolts instead of clipping into the lower half of the heater unit. This original motor is a part I restored for the other Duetto Spider I had on the channel last year. However, I couldn't find a good fan for it. This one doesn't tighten up properly, so I had to find a different unit and left this one in my spares. But between this original motor and the fan off the universal motor, I can make one good assembly. I'm going to fit some new wires onto this motor and give the plastic bits a bit of a clean. This original motor will press into place, so no screws or bolts required. This ducting tape is to keep the wires out of the way and out of sight when everything is assembled. And I've also put the outlet vents back onto the unit. This refurbished motor now moves a lot of air and it's quiet. It's always worth holding on to these older original parts. They were quality parts. This motor had been seized, sitting in my spares collection for years before I cleaned it up, and now it's as good as new. It would be a shame to throw away an original part like this. Here's that universal heater valve. And here's an original one, in parts. And here it is together. The fault with these original valves is that they block with sediment or scale formation over time, or the rubber diaphragm fails. Often a good cleaning will get it back into working order, and a new diaphragm can be sourced from a company like Classic Alpha or any of the other Alpha part suppliers. The valve bolts to the side of the heater unit like this, with the inlet pipe running through the unit. Let's get rid of this terrible cable for the old valve. This is the correct cable setup. The way this was set up before meant that the heater controls worked backwards. There is a radiator bypass flap inside these older units that opens and closes with the heater valve. As I said, it was in backwards. I'm just glad it hadn't been thrown out with the other older parts. But the problem with this one is that the end of the lever arm, where it connects to the heater valve, has been cut, so I need to weld this up and reshape it. Here you can see how all these parts fit together. As the heater valve opens, the bypass flap closes, forcing all the air through the radiator. And as the valve closes, it lets the air around the radiator. The main air flap is much more simple. Open and shut. I did have to make a new cable for this side, but it's all fairly straightforward. I don't have any clips to hold all this together in the factory style, unfortunately. So I'll be putting the rivets back into this. This isn't a restoration, remember, it's a repair job. I do have a couple of these side clips, so I'll throw these on. It's a belt and braces solution to keep the two halves of this together. I don't like the idea of only rivets holding the whole lower half in place. It's quite heavy. Here is the finished product, with the plumbing in place and some ducting to cover the holes left by the old cables. Overall, it's a big improvement, and it's much closer to original. I think this will help make the ownership and driving experience of this car much more enjoyable. This sort of thing, to me, is far more important than shiny paint or nice fancy wheels. So remember guys, repair, don't replace. And if you do replace something, try find something from a dedicated Alfa Romeo parts supplier. Don't just use what's on the shelf at your local auto parts store. In the long term, these universal parts just aren't worth it. But then again, I imagine these parts were installed sometime in the 1980s, when these cars weren't worth anything, really. Before I put this back, I need to install a new scuttle drain hose. The space to work under the dashboard is tight even without the heater box in place. Now, I just need to do some under dashboard yoga to get this unit back in place. And with any luck, this unit will work just fine for decades to come. Thanks for watching to the end. I know this is a bit of an odd video, a heater box. It's a strange topic to do a whole video on, but I was going to make one really long video about this car and getting it back on the road. But the more I worked on that video, the more I realized it was going to be over an hour long, and I lost some footage. So my original plan didn't really work out. So I thought I'd just do some individual videos about each topic on this car and just release them weekly instead of doing one long video that's been in the works for so long now. I thought it better just cut it up and release it. So this is the first video. Next video on the engine and the clutch will be out next weekend. And I'll do maybe 4 videos in this car, and then we'll get back onto the GTV. But before I go, I just want to say, as always, a big thank you to everyone who supports me on Patreon. It is a good way to support smaller YouTube channels. It really does help enormously. In particular, I want to thank the new patrons, Daniel Sundragord, Sipo Washhus, Goran Delia, or Goran Delija. I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce that. Sorry, mate. Scott S., Andrew Smith, Simon Fraser, R., Panagiotis Karpidas, and Alistair Wilmot. Thanks for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you all next weekend for the second episode of the Spider Recommission.